So today I'm going to concentrate on using the doc block controller annotation method in Laravel 5. So a little bit about me. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. And about 6 years ago, I moved to Italy with my wife. Yes, this is my house, somewhere in this slide. So be jealous. And this is my life. I do eat a lot of gelato. And no, actually, for the last 30 years of my life, I've been basically in front of a computer. And in the last few years, I've been learning how to speak with my hands. I work for a company called Mosaicon, and they are medializing people's brands. I've used PHP for almost 15 years now. I founded the local PHP user group, and I'm working on a book for Pact called Mastering Laravel 5. Okay, so if we're going to talk about doc block annotations, I thought to myself, let's break this problem down into atomic pieces. And when I want to know something, I go to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia says, in many, many, many more words, but summarized here, that an annotation is metadata attached to text, an image, or other data. So it's metadata attached to data. So what is metadata? So metadata is a cool word because it's half Greek and half Latin. And we see that meta means transcending or encompassing. But I like to think of it as extending or enriching. So it's something that adds value to something else. And everybody here knows what data is, I hope. So annotations in the real world go back a long time. So in 1200, we see the amanuensis wrote notes in the margin of the pages. And I don't know why there's this face here, but my college was run by Benedictine monks, so I've run into a lot of these in my life. Okay, let's talk about doc block annotations. Let's go to doc block. Well, doc block is a convention where we write a comment, but we do it in a very specific way. And here we do /***. And this tells, in this case, Java, that there's something interesting inside of there. An annotation is something that affects in some way the execution of the program. Annotations landed in Java in version 1.6. And we see here that we are telling Java that the speak method for cat, which extends animal, overrides the speak method of animal because the cat says meow. Simple enough. Let's look at doc block annotations. So putting the two together, we have our doc block, and we have our annotation. And this example from Behat tells us that this method, prepare, needs to be executed before everything else, the suite. Okay, so annotations in PHP are all over the place. In Zen and Symphony and Typo 3 in terms of frameworks, and in TDD and BDD, they're in Behat and PHP Unit, which is where I first discovered the concept. And in an ORM, such as Doctrine, it's used in helping define relations. Okay, so if you want a much more detailed talk about annotations, I suggest Raphael Dom's talk. And he talks in a very detailed way about the history of annotations in PHP and how they work. Okay, so we have the doc block annotation concept. Let's go on to Laravel. So Laravel, in case you have been living in a cave for the last year or two, was a new framework created by Taylor Otwell. And Taylor Otwell came from the .NET world, and he was looking for a cheap way to write some web applications. And he knew that PHP was ubiquitous and all over the web servers. So he started using CodeIgniter. But coming from the .NET world and things like C#, he maybe was used to more complicated and more advanced patterns. So he turned the CodeIgniter extension into Laravel. And versions 1 and 2 came out rather quickly. And from version 3 on, that's when we see the most well-known version of Laravel that the community really adopted very well. I started using Laravel shortly before version 4 came out. And the releases of Laravel were aligned with the Symphony releases, since Laravel uses heavily many Symphony packages. So, for example, when the Symphony release came out in April and October, the Laravel release came out in May and November. So, things were getting ready to release version 4.3 of Laravel, and there were many changes being made. So the community decided that it should be called Laravel 5.0. And so Laravel came out just a few weeks ago and introduced a lot of new ideas. And of course, now, with this famous screenshot taken from Google Trends, we see that there's no denying that the interest in Laravel continues to be very high. The adoption and use, though, we have to ask Taylor. Okay, so in version 4 to 4.2 of Laravel, everything was inside the app directory. And this reminds us of CodeIgniter or a similar framework where we have an MVC pattern where we have the models, the controller, and the models, the controllers, and the views all inside of the app directory. So for Laravel version 5, the app directory has gone on a diet. And some things like storage, for example, all of the logs, and tests, which are not considered part of the app, were pulled out to help thin down the app directory so that inside app could only be the essential parts of the application. Two notable additions are, one, the PHP spec YAML file, and PHP spec is also a dependency, so we can use it right out of the box, and also the ability to use gulp. The controllers directory has been moved inside of an HTTP directory along with routes, PHP, and this allows us to focus in terms of the RESTful aspect, our attention to only that directory, and keeps everything nice and clean and organized. So why would we want to use annotations for routes? Well, when I first started developing Laravel, every time I needed a route, I just threw the route in my routes file. So I had route controllers and get and post and some put and delete. And that file, as you can see, gets to be very, 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 very long. And when you have 3 or 4 developers working together, it can become unmanageable. And so I asked Taylor Otwell, I said, so tell me the history of route annotations so I don't get it wrong. And he said, it was an experiment in framework-agnostic controllers. And so, since Laravel belongs to the FIG, to the Framework Interoperability Group, obviously they would like that you can use Laravel, but of course that you can also continue to use other frameworks and not have framework lock-in. So this makes the controller more portable. But, as many experiments go, sometimes the results are not what we thought they should be. So, about 6 weeks ago, after much discussion in the community, this feature was taken out of Laravel. And so, my heart broke. But there's a good ending to the story. So, 4 developers, among who there is also Kayla Daniels, who's been doing a lot of interesting things in the community, they have decided to form a group called the Laravel Collective and basically adopt all of these packages which have been pulled out of Laravel. So whether we call them removed or deprecated, one thing is for sure, Laravel wants to stay light. And so, as Rasmus Lerdorf said, the thing I don't like about a framework is that every time I boot the framework, I need to ask, am I connected to Postgres or MySQL? So anything we can take out of the framework to lighten it is a plus. For example, the HTML builder package will not be used if we're only building RESTful APIs because we might have something like AngularJS on the front end. OK, so how do we install this? Well, like many stories begin, we do composer require, do the Laravel collective repository, and the annotations package. The next step is to create an annotations service provider. And that's rather simple. And then add the annotation service provider to the app.php file. And there's an array of providers. This basically tells Laravel, when it boots, that the annotation service provider is ready. So now it's time to go to work. So my boss came to me and he said, as a conference speaker, I want you to tell a joke so that everybody laughs. And I wish that my job could be this easy. OK, now let's really go to work. As a hotel website user, I want to search for a hotel so that I can reserve a room. So let's say we're building a Travelocity clone. OK. So before I get into the example, there's one side note. We'll be using the artisan command line tool. And for those of you that don't know, artisan helps us automate a lot of the boring tasks that are involved in building web applications, such as performing migrations and creating controllers and many, many other things. OK, that said, let's go to work. So we'll type PHP artisan make controller hotels controller. And I like that the syntax is very expressive. It reads very well. So our hotels controller will interact with our hotel entity or our hotel model. Now, since we will be scanning this controller for annotations, we need to tell the annotations package to include this file in its list of files to control, or to check. So as you can see, there's a simple array called scan routes, and we'll just throw hotels controller in there. And I'm using yellow so that you can see what is important in each slide, because there's a lot of code. So, OK, now at this point, we have a very simple step. We add to the class the doc block annotation, resource hotels. Now, we've turned our controller into a resource. This will give us the basic CRUD operations and allow us to add in the methods that we need. In the lower right-hand corner, I've included so that we can compare the standard Laravel way of doing it. So it's a little bit lighter in terms of code because we see we just do resources hotels and we're done. Otherwise, we would have to open up the routes.php file and add the hotels controller and map that to the hotels request. One very important thing is that we must use double quotes. Otherwise, it won't work. OK, so since my boss, he asked me to search for a hotel, I need to have a way to do that. So in my hotels controller, I will add a doc block annotation that maps to a get. So I'll be sending in some parameters to my get request. And that will respond unto the URL hotels search. And I've created a method search to handle that request. Now, we haven't told Laravel to use that annotation. So we now need to use artisan to scan that route. And so, again, the syntax reads very well. PHP artisan route scan. And we're done. So in the storage framework directory, we can see the result of this method. And it produces a file called routes.scanned.php. And for now, we don't have any other options. So, for example, we have a middleware and where that are empty arrays, and we're not limiting on a domain, and we're not using any aliases. So those values are null. This file does not get put into source code control. And that should become And we'll understand why very shortly. But if every time I add an annotation into my doc block, that could become very tedious. So there's a shortcut. The service provider has a Boolean variable, scan when local, and we can simply set that to true. By setting that to true, when we're working in our local environment, every time we execute the program and boot the framework, it will scan all of the files in that list for annotations. Now, of course, this makes things a little bit slower, but it's, a fraction of a second, I suppose. But that's sure better than having to either type PHP artisan route scan or putting some sort of file watcher, a file system watcher that runs the script. So if anybody here would like a step-by-step walkthrough of creating a simple route in using Laravel 4, I also did a presentation about a year ago that covers in more detail that method. So let's compare the Laravel doc block annotations with a Symphony package that's called Sensio Framework Extra Bundle. And I don't work in Symphony, but it's pretty clear that the syntax, both for the controller as well as the annotation, are pretty similar. So if we are used to Symphony or Zend, this shouldn't be that difficult. In this example, I've included Zend because Zend also, in their Zend Framework 2 annotated router, gives us the possibility to add a get method onto, to map a get request to the method. And of course, the Zend syntax in this package, and there are several for Zend, again, is rather similar. Okay, so I searched for the hotel, and now I want to display the hotel that we're interested in. So to do that, the user will click on our web page, and we'll fire a request to hotels / and we'll pass the ID. So to demonstrate another possibility with doc block annotations, we can use a where clause. And this will limit everything to one or more numbers, as you can see by the \d plus. And again, in the lower right is the Laravel standard way of doing it. And basically, we just chain the where limitation onto the end of the get. So each framework has a different term. In Laravel, it's called where. In Symphony, it's a requirement. And in Zend, it's a constraint. So conceptually, it's the same thing, because we're just basically saying that there should be an ID, and it should have one or more digits, and not be alphanumeric, for example. Okay. Now, since we've displayed the room that we want to reserve, we need to create a reservations controller that will interact with our reservations backend. So once again, it can't be any more simple. PHP artisan make controller, and this will create our reservations controller. Now, we need to book the room, but we need to be logged in. So Laravel provides authentication right out of the box, basically by saying middleware auth. If the user is not logged in, it will redirect the user to the login page. And so as we see here, we've stacked the middleware on top. We packed in the middleware together with a post, and we'll pass all of our information to a post room method. And again, at the bottom, it's just a third parameter into the post routing. If, for example, I decide that I want to limit all the requests to a particular domain, for example, in our case, we have booking and then the name of our hotel website, .com, I can tell Laravel that this controller is limited to this domain. And again, at the bottom, there's the third command, which is an array, passing in the middleware auth, and the domain, and that will act on the post method to bookroom. Okay, so one of the interesting new things about Laravel 5 is that it has brought in the concept of a command that before was not present in Laravel 4, at least not in this particular way. So again, as we've said now several times, it's very simple. PHP artisan, make command, ReserveRoom. Now, let's look at the contents of this file. In this particular situation, I told the command that I would like to handle itself, or that the handle method will be actually inside of the ReserveRoom method. So it creates so I have my constructor, I'll do what I need to do, and then it will handle itself. We can optionally break this into two classes where we will have a separate handler class for that command. Now, going back to the controller, we have the post. The post arrives into bookroom. The user is authenticated. And now we will dispatch that command down the command bus and pass in, for example, the start and the end date of the hotel and how many rooms we want, and it's an array. The user is authenticated, so we need to maybe pass that into the command. And now, once the command is sent on the command bus, we want to launch an event. We want to fire an event. This syntax is a tiny bit different. So we would do PHP artisan, make event, room was reserved. So here we have the name of the event. Okay, so now inside the handler method of my command, I will use this helper method, which is just simply event. It's so simple. I pass in a new instantiation of my room was reserved event. Okay, so I received the request. I sent it to my controller. I created a command. The command went down the command bus, launched the event, and now I need to handle the event. And so this syntax is, again, a little bit more different than the syntax we've seen before. So we would do PHP artisan handler event room reserved email. This will be how we will handle the event. And then as a final parameter, the event that we care about, room was reserved. Okay, so this here's is another router annotation having to deal with events. And so by saying here's, we mean that we want to listen to the room was reserved event and do something with it. So in the lower right-hand corner, we can see that we created, using the event listen facade, a way to map as the first parameter the room was reserved event with its handler, the handle method of the handler class, room reserved email. And as we did with our controller, we need to add in this event into the scanned events array. And this will allow us, when we execute the command, to look inside of this class for the information that we need inside of the doc block. And now, in a similar way that we have executed PHP artisan route scan, now we execute PHP artisan event scan, and it scans all of the events. So let's take a look at the output of this the output of this artisan command, and we will see again, as the previous, as several slides ago, we saw that we have listen, passing in an array of things we want to listen to. In this case, the room was ReservedEvent, and then the second parameter, which is the handler, how we will handle it. We will send an email. So when we're all done, in storage framework, we have two files, events.scanned.php and routes.scan.php. So just as a quick recap, whereas in Laravel 4, we did the HTTP request, handled it with the router, and then sent it to the controller. Now, in Laravel 5, we're using the command bus by creating a command inside of controller, launching an event, and using the pub sub way of doing things, we have a handler that listens to that event. There's one caveat here, though. Laravel has a caching mechanism where it caches its routes to make them faster. And this method is executed like this: PHP artisan route cache. And Laravel will tell you that it cleared the cache, first of all, and then secondly, that it cached them. So if I scan all of my controllers and all of my events, and I produce my routes.scan file, I need to do that before I cache my routes. Because otherwise, once I create my cached routes file, that will be used instead of the routes file that we have in the base directory. And so it can be a little bit tricky. And the caching mechanism used by Laravel is to base 64 encode all of the routes and then serialize them. So here we see the output, and this is faster than reading in the routes file. So this is a file called routes, which lives in storage/framework. So it can be a little bit tricky. So not to get them confused, we see routes.scan.php, which is the result of the scan, which reads all of the annotations inside of the doc block. And then routes.php, which is the result of the routes of the route caching. And again, only routes.php will be used if it exists. And here we see all three files together. The events are not cached, so the events.scan.php file will be used, and then routes.php will be used. Routes.scan.php will not be used. So we have available all of the standard HTTP verbs that we're used to: delete, get, options. Options returns a list of all of the available verbs on that controller or that resource. Patch post input, we know very well. And then in the right-hand column, I'm showing you basically what the other options are available. So, since this package was pulled out of Laravel, there are many advantages and many disadvantages to using this technique. And everybody here can probably think of one or two as I was giving my presentation. But I would like to talk about several of them now. So one advantage to doc block annotations is that each controller remains independent. As I said, when I began to collaborate with 2 or 3 other developers in my company, every time we added in a route, of course, we had to commit that and worry about git push and git pull. And everybody needed to always have the latest version of the routes.php file. The result of the scan is not in source code control. So I don't really care about what the other controllers are doing. I only can just focus on my controller, add in my annotations, build everything in local, and then when everything moves into the continuous delivery environment, there will be a script that builds everybody's annotations independently. So it's a load off of my shoulder. Another advantage is that the router annotation keeps the method together with its annotation. So just as we document, we have here basically a living documentation, and because the post book room is actually what is going on, and the reserve is actually the method that would be executed. Because otherwise, if I start into a new project and I find the controller, and when I want to figure out what it responds to, I have to go and search in my routes.php file and find the reference to that controller or find the reference to that method. And doing that over and over again uses up a lot of time. Since the syntax is similar, developers coming in from Symphony and Zend, or from the Java world, or even from the C# world, because there are also annotations, slightly different, but in those languages, they will find annotations familiar. So it would be easy to work with for somebody who's very experienced with this. And now, let's talk about the disadvantages, because there are. So the most obvious disadvantage is that code and comments should not mix. And this is a very hot topic right now. Because if I'm a new developer coming into a project and I've never seen a doc block annotation, and if for some reason my editor is not set up to intelligently color the syntax green or highlight it in some way telling me that inside that annotation there's important information, I just may simply think that that's a comment. And when I first started using PHP unit and I saw the data provider, I wasn't immediately aware that that was actually used. So that could trip up many new developers. Another disadvantage is we are tightly linking the controller to the route. And this can be a problem if we want to keep things nice and clean, nice and separate. Because if we maybe want to take this controller and use it in a different context, we would then have to pull out all of the annotations or come up with another mechanism to intelligently handle that. And the last disadvantage is that, as I had mentioned previously, when we have a project with several developers and we go to build this, we need to have something in our continuous delivery machine that actually executes PHP artisan scan or PHP artisan route scan. If you're just a single developer and you're just used to deploying via git pull or git checkout or something like that, that could be something that might be rather cumbersome. And despite the fact that PHP internally does not have support for annotations, it appears that, once again, the community is beginning to maybe think about it. So the future of annotations in PHP is still wide open, and we don't know how it's going to end, but I like doc block annotations. I think they're useful. I think that they're one of many tools that needs to be evaluated. And I think if used properly, it can save a lot of time in development and lighten the development load. And I can't be who I am today without thanking my 11 colleagues in Italy. Okay, are there any questions? They are much better graphic designers than I am. Okay, I think he's bringing the microphone to you.
Hi. I have a question. One of the things I like from the route file is that I can group routes so I only have to type one if I have filters like authorization or any other thing. How can we handle that with annotations?
Well, at this time, I don't think that that's possible. Since now that the project is in the hands of the Laravel collective, there are several pull requests open. I would suggest that we can maybe come up with a way to implement that. But if each controller is separate, we're not grouping them together. So I think that it helps each controller to be independent. But when you don't have that routes file, you don't have that ability to group them together. Again, Taylor Odwell said that it's an experiment in framework agnostic controllers. So I should be able to pick up this controller and use it in a different context. But yeah, you're definitely right. That's a difficult issue that needs to be solved.
Usually, I might forget to apply one filter, or so right now I like that. I have a new resource. I put it in the file inside the group, and I'm done with it. I don't have to think too much about it.
Right. I also do the same thing. I put about 20 resource controllers inside of the group, applying the authentication filter. Because if you leave a controller outside of the authentication, right, you expose that controller to anybody who can just either by chance or through some hacking start sending requests to that URL.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, I was wondering if there's maybe a middle way between using the comments and having it all in the roots file. Because you want to group the roots together with the actions that they're routing to. But you could do that without having to go as far as encoding all this information in comments, right? Couldn't you have a method on the controller itself that returns roots for all its actions or something like that, that wouldn't require parsing comments? It could be done by the application itself, even per request, and then cache that, something like that. Has anyone done something like that, or what would be the problems with that?
Not that I know of, but that seems logical that there would be a way to annotate the base controller class. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but not with annotations and comments, just in code. Have a method like getRoots that the framework would know to call on each controller to figure out how to map the URLs to the actions that are within that controller. That would at least avoid the problem of burying information in comments. You might still need to run a command on the shell for something to run those methods and build a roots file. But yeah, I was just wondering if anyone's done something like that.
As I said, I would suggest looking at the GitHub repository. As I speak, even like several hours ago, there were new pull requests that have come in, and the developers are, moving this project along because there are many people who like this approach. So I would suggest sending a pull request and or at least opening up an issue. I think that the four people who are maintaining the repository, because they will actually guarantee support for the annotations package. I think that they're interested in all of everybody's ideas. I mean, Laravel 5 has been out just 2 weeks, and so all of the packages now are being updated to work with it. So there's a little bit of we need a little bit of time, I think. Yes?
Hi, I'm actually interested in that event that you generated previously. I noticed in the method that you were just calling event, and I was just trying to figure out where it came from.
Okay, so let's go back. Here?
Just before before the handler.
Right, it's hard to show a lot of code on a lot of slides and not confuse people.
Yes, right there.
Okay.
The one highlighted in yellow.
Okay, this class is called ReserveRoom, and remember that it is instantiated inside of my reservations controller, right? So in my reserve method, I instantiate ReserveRoom, and dispatch sends it down the bus. And since when I instantiate that command, automatically the handler code is launched. Inside of the handle method, I then launch a new event. Room was reserved.
Yeah, that line is what I'm asking about. Unless I'm missing something, I'm not sure what event, that method called event, with the object room reserved.
Event is a helper method.
Okay, all right.
It's just a shortcut.
I see.
And that basically creates a new event. And then event is sent to here. I think it's difficult to see, it's difficult to show so much code together so fast. We might have to see it several times.
One right at the very back. Right back there in that back right corner.
Hey, can you separate further the annotation from the actual route? So, for example, if you give it a name and then use it in a template, so you're changing the route only in the controller, not in the template.
Not sure if I heard. Are you saying that if I can? Are you asking me if I can use the alias command? There's a way that I can use as, and there's also an option to the as, which creates an alias that I can use in my templating.
Yes. Is there a notation for it?
Yeah, that's as. So I would pass that as a second parameter here, for example.
Okay.
So I could do request to get, and then comma, and then my second parameter would be as equals, and then the alias in double quotes. And that would allow the front end guys to use that in a template.
Thanks.
One down the front here.
Using framework is really good thing. So
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
using framework is a really good thing. It increases the speed of development. But what's the penalty of the performance penalty of using all this framework?
Well, every framework has some overhead. I mean, I'm not sure in terms of microseconds of execution, if that's what you mean. I mean, obviously there's maybe 100 microseconds or less that is required to load all of the classes and actually boot the framework. As I said, Laravel 5 is a lot faster because now with route caching and pulling out some of the non-essential classes, that helps it go faster. Does that help to answer your question? I mean, so the advantage of a framework is that it helps somebody very quickly create a web application. When that web application grows, then of course, and of course if the use of that web application scales, that's when frameworks show their limitation. Right? So many people say, if I need a very high availability application to be run on, like Facebook or something, obviously a framework is not the right choice. But I think that 99% of the applications don't have major issues with scalability because they tend to be used by very few people. I mean, so for every Facebook, right, there's 100,000 applications that are just run by 6 people or 50 people, 500 people, 5,000. Does that answer your question? It's not, I mean, again, the framework or no framework is a long debate, right?
Has anyone performance checked the way that gets cached in the roots? Because does that mean in the cache file, every time the system bootstraps, it's got to base 64 decode and unserialize a string just to build an array? Wouldn't it be better to just cache that as native PHP code, which like an op cache would deal with then? If the
routes file, which is text, needs to be parsed, that's more slow than doing a base 64 decode and unserialize. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, but when that
I don't have performance numbers on that, but they say it could even be up to 100 times faster.
Really?
It depends on your use case, because you're again, you're hitting that routes file. If your routes file has 350 lines, and hopefully you haven't used too many closures or anything like that, but all of that code needs to be parsed and in real time. That's slow. So by caching everything, reading it right into memory.
Sure, I understand the caching, but when you unserialize that will eventually turn into an array or an object or an array of objects or something. Wouldn't it be better to just make that file, when you generate it, the array of objects as it's meant to be, rather than going to the effort of having to sort of decode it and unserialize it on every bootstrap? I'm just wondering.
I don't really know.
Fair enough.
The read time for... It's a good question. I mean, the read time for one line versus... Because you're saying it should be an array, so
yeah, but
it could be hundreds of...
PHP 5.5 would opcode cache and store it all in RAM anyway, so I don't know if it does do that when it deserializes it anyway.
Right, well, the minimum requirement's still 5.4. So...
I was wondering if, I don't know if anyone had benchmarked it, if someone just thought that was a neat way of storing a huge array.
I think that we need a little bit more time. Like I said, 5.5 did not have a beta. It was just immediately released. And so now the community is up to,
Sure.
Everybody needs to upgrade their packages and make everything work with 5. But in the meantime, they did a lot of work under the hood to make everything work very well.
Okay, thank you.